Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
He raised his glass, looked around the room full of people, then turned to me, smiling like he'd just handed me a crown made of diamonds and pearls. And then, with his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, and his mother watching like a hawk from 2 seats down, he said it. "She's not perfect, but she'll do." The room broke into polite laughter, those awkward chuckles people give when they're not quite sure what they just heard. His best friend slapped the table, his cousin let out a wheeze, and even the waitress gave a nervous smile before retreating. And there I was, frozen in my chair, the warmth draining from my face. I looked around like someone might stand up and say, "Hey, that was a joke gone too far. Let's try that toast again." But no one did. I don't remember much else from the dinner. I sat there nodding, smiling at the wrong moments, chewing on overcooked salmon like it was rubber, while my brain went completely still. Not because I was confused, but because I wasn't. That was the scary part. I knew exactly what he meant. He'd been saying it in 100 different ways for months, and I had been translating it into something gentler in my head. We had been together for 2 years. Ethan was charming, the kind of man who always knew which wine to order, which fork to use, who to nod at in a crowded room. He made me laugh at first. He was funny in that dry, quick-witted Ivy League kind of way. He wore confidence like cologne, and people gravitated toward him. I met him after my divorce, when I had just started feeling like a person again. He came in fast, like most mistakes do, and I convinced myself he was the fresh start I needed. But then came the small corrections. "Maybe wear something less loud for dinner with my parents," he'd say, or, "You don't need to bring that up again, it's not a good look." The first time he asked if I wanted to grow out my hair, "Just a suggestion, it softens your face," I laughed. The third time, I stopped laughing. He never raised his voice. That wasn't his style. He was subtle, strategic. He made me doubt myself without ever using a harsh word, and I fell for it. Because I wanted to believe I was hard to love. My ex-husband had left me feeling like a burden, like something to be endured, not cherished. And Ethan, he didn't run. That was the bar I had set. He stayed, and I thought that was enough. I knew I should have walked months ago. There were signs, little moments where my stomach tightened. Like when I told him about my dream of going back to school, and he nodded politely and then changed the subject to his client's new yacht. Or the way he flinched when I laughed too loudly in front of his coworkers. But every time I got close to saying something, I'd see that look in his eyes. The same one he gave to his dog when it barked too much. Patient, dismissive. Still, I stayed. Because I'd told myself I was being dramatic. Because he hadn't done anything truly awful. Because the wedding was already being planned. Because his mother had already ordered custom linens. Because it was easier to smile through it than to start over. Again, but that toast, that one line. It snapped something inside me clean in half. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true, for him. I would never be more than good enough. Not brilliant, not precious, not someone to fight for. Just acceptable. So after dessert, while he was still shaking hands and posing for pictures, I excused myself from the table. I stood up, smoothed out my dress, picked up my purse, and walked over to Marla, who had just begun telling a story about her third cousin's wedding in Naples. I placed my hand lightly on her shoulder and said, "Thanks for dinner, Marla. It was lovely." She blinked. "Where are you going, Jessica?" I smiled, a polite practice smile. "Home." And then I walked out. I didn't run, I didn't cry, I didn't throw anything or make a scene. I walked out like I was leaving a PTA meeting that had gone 10 minutes too long. In the parking lot, I pulled out my phone, canceled our joint checking account access, changed my Amazon login, and then booked a hotel under a name I hadn't used since college, Jess Monroe. That night, I sat on a stiff hotel bed with a glass of white wine from a vending machine and turned off my phone. I looked around the beige, impersonal room, and for the first time in over a year, I felt safe. Not happy, not excited, but safe. I didn't sleep much. My body was still buzzing, my brain running through scenarios. What he'd say, how he'd spin it, whether he'd even realize what he did. But the thing that hit me the hardest, the thing that kept me staring at the ceiling until sunrise, was how it had been. How fast I left. No hesitation, just a clean break. That's how I knew it was right. The next morning, I checked out just after 6, stopped at a diner for coffee and eggs, and headed straight to a storage unit I'd been paying for quietly since January. It had started as a backup plan, a place to stash a few things when Ethan had made some comment about finally having a woman who didn't take up all the closet space. Inside the unit was a suitcase, some cash, an old laptop, and a notebook full of details, conversations, feelings, red flags. I hadn't realized how prepared I was until that moment. Ethan didn't wake up to a note. He didn't get a text. He didn't get closure. He woke up to an empty house, a quiet phone, and a canceled engagement. And that was just the beginning, because if he thought I'd settle for being good enough, then he clearly hadn't been paying attention. Some men cheat with their bodies, some cheat with their money, but Ethan cheated with his ego. Constantly, consistently, and without shame. He never strayed physically, or at least not that I knew of, but that didn't matter much to me in the end. What he did was quieter, more insidious. He built himself up by knocking me down one notch at a time, always with a smile on his face and that casual air of superiority that somehow made his insults feel like compliments, until I started listening a little closer. It's the kind of betrayal that doesn't leave lipstick on collars or strange numbers in phones, but instead leaves a woman second-guessing herself in the mirror each morning, wondering why she's suddenly so careful about everything she says, everything she wears, everything she wants. I had started to notice the pattern long before the engagement dinner. It crept in gradually, like a leak you don't notice until the floorboards start to warp beneath your feet. At first, it was just little comments in front of his friends. Nothing overt. Just casual things like, Jess doesn't really get into politics, or she's not much of a cook, but she tries. At first, I'd laugh along, thinking we were joking, ribbing each other like any normal couple. But I noticed he never did that with his guy friends. He never reduced them to stereotypes or made their personal business into punchlines at parties. It was just me. I was the material. I was the easy laugh. So I started writing things down, not with the intention of revenge, at least not in the beginning. I just needed a place to get the fog out of my head, to see it in black and white. I bought a small notebook, nothing fancy, and I started keeping track. It was part journal, part evidence log. There was the time he made fun of the way I held my wine glass at a work dinner, the way he dismissed my promotion as cute, the afternoon he told Tina, right in front of me, that I was obsessed with therapy, like it was a bad thing. I didn't share it with anyone yet. I just kept adding to it, page by page, trying to understand whether I was overreacting or whether something deeper was really going wrong beneath the surface. The week after the dinner, I stayed mostly offline, but not entirely silent. I had created a private Instagram account months ago under a fake name, CleverPeach78, if you must know, and I used it mostly to follow people connected to Ethan, his old classmates, his coworkers, his ex-girlfriends, and yes, even his mother's inner circle. It wasn't stalking, it was research. I watched how he moved through the world when I wasn't looking, how people talked about him when he wasn't in the room. You'd be surprised what people post when they think only friends are watching. I found a few women who had clearly had run-ins with him before. One of them referred to him as Mr. High Horse, and another hinted at some kind of emotional fallout that had left her in therapy for a year. It wasn't enough to call out publicly, but it confirmed something for me. I wasn't the only one who'd felt like she'd slowly disappeared while dating Ethan. Tina, my best friend since high school and someone who never liked Ethan from the beginning, offered to help when I told her what I was planning. She didn't ask for details. She didn't lecture me about taking the high road or staying classy. She just said, "Point me in the direction and I'll light the match." That's why I love her. She knew exactly what kind of quiet, calculated storm I was about to unleash. We started small. I emailed a couple of anonymous tips to a gossip newsletter that Marla read religiously. Nothing cruel, just questions. Is it true the Crawfords had to cancel the engagement because of an undisclosed incident at the dinner? Sources say the bride walked out. What did the groom say to offend her? I made sure they came from dummy email addresses with no traceable links. Within days, those whispers had turned into conversations. People started texting me out of the blue, not to ask if I was okay, but to ask what happened, because of course they had to know. And the thing is, I didn't tell them. That was the trick. I let them wonder. I gave them breadcrumbs and let their curiosity fill in the rest. The more I stayed quiet, the louder the gossip got. By Monday morning, Ethan was fielding phone calls from confused coworkers and awkward clients who had heard that the wedding might be off. Apparently, Marla had already begun spinning a version of the story that made me sound emotional, which I expected. But her usual polished veneer was starting to crack. A friend of Tina's who worked with Marla at the library overheard her on the phone with a family friend whispering furiously about public embarrassment and ungrateful women who don't know what they've got. She didn't name names, of course. She never would. But the tone was unmistakable. Marla Crawford was losing control of the narrative, and that alone was delicious. I was staying at a small Airbnb outside town by then, a converted garage loft with peeling paint and the best little bakery 3 blocks down. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and every morning I'd wake up, make myself a cup of coffee, and smile while scrolling through the quiet chaos I had set in motion. Ethan was trying to do damage control, but he didn't know where the hits were coming from. And that was the whole point. He couldn't fight back because I hadn't made any accusations. I hadn't posted angry tweets or written public essays. I hadn't even told mutual friends the full truth. I let him drown in his own ambiguity. The questions were doing all the work for me. By Wednesday, I received an email from one of Ethan's coworkers, someone I barely knew, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, just to talk. She said she admired how I'd handled everything. I hadn't even responded when Tina called me and said, "You won't believe it. He showed up at your old place looking for you, and when he realized you were gone, he asked if I'd seen you. I told him I hadn't, and I smiled. A lot." That night, I poured myself another glass of wine and opened the notebook I'd been keeping since the beginning. I flipped through the pages, now wrinkled and ink-stained and full of hard, brutal honesty. I had written all of it down for me, but now I was starting to think I'd been writing it for someone else too. Someone who might need to see what this kind of pain looks like before it becomes a headline. Or worse, a regret. The best revenge isn't yelling or crying or breaking things. It's silence. It's being unbothered while the person who hurt you scrambles to put the pieces together and realizes they were the villain in the story all along. Ethan had spent 2 years quietly dismantling me, and now I was returning the favor. No noise, no fire, just a whisper campaign with a very loud impact. There is a particular kind of woman who believes the world should bend itself into neat little shapes for the sake of appearances. Marla Crawford was precisely that woman, and though I had known it from the first afternoon tea she insisted I attend, I had convinced myself I could play along for the greater good. I told myself that every family had a matriarch who needed appeasing, that it was part of the deal, a necessary evil in exchange for stability and a future with Ethan. But what I didn't see, what I refused to admit, was that I wasn't being accepted into a family. I was being auditioned for a role, one written decades before I walked in, and no matter what I said or did, I was never meant to pass the test. The tea party was supposed to be a celebration of the upcoming union, a chance for Marla to show off her soon-to-be daughter-in-law to her tightly curated circle of friends. Retired judges' wives, old money matriarchs, local socialites who still carried handkerchiefs, and spoke in compliments wrapped in thinly veiled insults. The invitation arrived in the mail, not handed to me directly, as if the formality itself was a gift. It was printed on thick cream paper with gold script, and it read more like a royal summons than a cordial invitation. "Please join us in celebrating the engagement of Ethan Crawford and Miss Jessica Monroe," it said, with all the warmth of a tax bill. In the days leading up to the event, Marla called 3 separate times to go over what I should wear, what I should say, and what topics were best avoided. No politics, obviously, she had said, and steer clear of your job. Most of the women attending won't relate to the concept of school counseling. They're used to women of leisure. Keep things light. She had paused, then added, and I wouldn't mention your divorce. It's not relevant anymore. I remember staring at the phone in silence for a moment, feeling a heat rise up the back of my neck. Not because I was ashamed of my past, but because she had the gall to think I might be. I spent the morning of the tea not getting ready, but writing a letter, one I had been composing in my mind for weeks. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but it contained every unspoken truth I had choked back over countless dinners, family gatherings, and phone calls with Ethan's mother. I wrote about the time she asked me with a smile if I had considered doing something about those fine lines before the wedding. I described the subtle digs she made whenever I mentioned my father, a mechanic who passed away when I was 23, who she once referred to as blue-collar but surely good with his hands. I detailed the night she told Ethan that he had settled for someone kind, and the way he had laughed and said nothing in my defense. When I finished the letter, I placed it in an envelope, along with a framed photograph of Ethan and me taken at the engagement photo shoot, one I had paid for, planned, and been told to tone down my smile for. On the back of the photo, I scrawled a single line from the engagement dinner toast. She's not perfect, but she'll do. I tucked it neatly into a package addressed to Marla Crawford, along with a second envelope marked for guests. That envelope contained printed cards with the following announcement. The wedding of Jessica Monroe and Ethan Crawford has been postponed indefinitely due to the bride's sudden realization that she deserves more than adequacy. It was dramatic, yes, but sometimes clarity is. The package was delivered that afternoon, an hour before the tea was scheduled to begin. I had arranged for it to be dropped off by a local courier, who I paid in cash and who asked no questions. Meanwhile, I checked into a small spa 2 counties over and turned off my phone. I let my hair down, slipped into a robe, and sat in a steam room while back home, polite chaos unfurled among porcelain teacups and finger sandwiches. I would later hear, through the ever-reliable grapevine of suburban gossip, that the party had started off tense and gotten worse by the minute. Marla had tried to keep things together, greeting guests with tight smiles and a tone sharp enough to slice butter, but once the announcement was read, silence descended over the room like fog. Some of the older women whispered. A few excused themselves early. One even muttered, "Good for her," under her breath before leaving. The framed photo remained unopened on the gift table, its smirking contents protected by a layer of decorative wrapping and a bow the color of old money. By the following day, Marla's version of events had already begun to evolve. In her first retelling, I had become overwhelmed by the pressure of planning and needed space. In the second, Ethan and I had agreed to postpone mutually, though her tone implied that I had simply failed to rise to the occasion. What she could never say, what none of them could admit, was that I had walked out on their perfect narrative because I saw the script and refused to read from it. Ethan didn't reach out until 2 days later. I saw his name flash on my screen while I was waiting for a massage, and for a brief second, I felt that old pang of guilt, the one that whispers maybe you're being too harsh, maybe he didn't mean it like that. But I reminded myself of every moment I had spent shrinking, biting my tongue, dressing in beige, and pretending that bland approval was the same as love. I let the call go to voicemail. Later that evening, I received a text from Ben, Ethan's older brother. We had only spoken a handful of times, but there was a quiet understanding between us. He never bought into the performance the rest of the family clung to. His message was short, but it said everything I needed to hear. I don't blame you. He never deserved you. I stared at those words for a long time, not because I believed them entirely, but because they landed differently. They didn't ask me to explain. They didn't imply I had overreacted. They simply saw me. That night, I went for a walk by the water near the spa. The moon was low, the air was soft, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't waiting for an apology or a confession or a chance to fix something that had never really been mine to fix. I let the salt air sting my skin, let the silence settle over me, and I thought about Marla in her dining room, surrounded by the ruins of her tea party, her voice brittle with embarrassment as she explained away my absence. She had said once, half joking, that joining the Crawford family was a privilege not everyone was suited for. She was right. I wasn't suited for servitude. I wasn't built to be decorative, digestible, or docile. I wasn't going to smile and nod while being sliced into someone else's idea of enough. The invitation had called it a celebration, but what they really wanted was a coronation, and I never wanted the crown. I once read that you should never trust someone who calls themselves honest, because truly honest people don't have to say it out loud. That quote stuck with me the first time Ethan told me, during an argument that started over something as small as a missed dinner reservation, that he was just being honest when he said I had a tendency to overreact. That was the beginning of the subtle unraveling, the quiet dismantling of who I thought I was. And for a while, I believed him, not because he was right, but because it was easier than confronting the idea that I had once again chosen a man who saw my boundaries as personal challenges. Long before the toast at the engagement dinner, before the walkout and the framed insult delivered to Marla's prim little event, I had been building a list. It started one morning after an argument that left me crying in the bathroom with the faucet running so he wouldn't hear. I remember staring into the mirror and wondering when exactly I had started apologizing for existing in a way that made people uncomfortable. I had been through this before, during my first marriage to David, where love had been measured in tolerance and silence. Back then, I had thought I was the problem, that maybe I expected too much or communicated too poorly. Therapy had taught me otherwise, but old habits die hard, especially when dressed in the charm of someone like Ethan Crawford. The list began as a coping mechanism, something my therapist had suggested years earlier. Write down moments that feel wrong, even if you can't explain why, she had said. So I did. I began with small things. Comments Ethan made at dinner parties, the way he seemed to rewrite conversations in his favor, the fact that he never truly apologized unless he needed something. But the list grew faster than I anticipated. It soon included emotional withdrawals, strategically timed silences, and those carefully disguised criticisms that always arrived under the guise of concern. I just want you to be your best self, he'd say, after pointing out that my laugh was a little too loud or my clothes a bit too bold. What he never knew was that I kept that list in 3 places. One, written by hand in a notebook I kept locked in my glove compartment. Another, saved in a private document on an old laptop he didn't know I still had. And a third, emailed to a burner account I had created under my maiden name, just in case. The act of writing it down wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about clarity. It was about reminding myself that I wasn't imagining things, that I had the right to call out the behavior that chipped away at my sense of self, one seemingly insignificant moment at a time. But after the dinner, after the toast that peeled the mask off so publicly that even Ethan's most loyal enablers had to flinch, the list took on a different meaning. It became a blueprint, not for destruction, but for escape, for freedom, for balance, and yes, a little bit of justice. By the time I was settled in the beach rental, I'd found on short notice a creaky old house 2 hours outside the city with a sloping porch and a view of the water that made up for the chipped paint. I had already sent copies of the list to 3 very specific people. The first was Ben, Ethan's older brother, who I knew would read it and never breathe a word of it to anyone, but who needed to understand the full picture. The second was to Marla, though I didn't include my name. I simply sent it from a neutral email with the subject line, "In case you're still wondering." The third went to someone Ethan never would have suspected, his business partner, Jack. I didn't need to accuse Ethan of anything criminal or professionally damning. I just sent him a selection of quotes, taken directly from texts, emails, and transcribed conversations that revealed who Ethan was behind closed doors. A man who said things like, "She's average, but she looks better when she listens," and "I've got her train." Just smile and nod, and she forgets why she's mad. It was his own words doing the damage, not mine. I just handed them over. I wasn't interested in scorched earth, at least not publicly. That's never been my style. But what I did want was for the people around Ethan to feel the weight of the truth, to be faced with the version of him I had known intimately, but had never been allowed to name. And once I started doing that, once the list became more than just a private chronicle of disappointment, I realized something even more important. I had never needed his permission to leave, only my own. Of course, there were calls, texts, emails, messages from mutual friends asking if we could talk, if I could clear the air. A few even had the nerve to suggest I should at least explain myself, because, as one of his cousins put it, people are starting to talk, and it's better if they hear it from you. I ignored them all, not out of cruelty, but out of principle. I didn't owe anyone a narrative that made them feel more comfortable about my choice to walk away. They had all heard him say it, after all. They had been there at the dinner. They knew exactly what he thought of me. And if they didn't speak up then, they had no right to demand clarity now. Instead, I drafted one final message, a Dropbox folder, carefully organized and labeled. It included select screenshots, a scan of the list, a copy of the engagement toast transcribed word for word, and a short note. This is why I left. I didn't share it with the world, just with the people who mattered, the ones who had sent save the dates and booked hotels, the ones who deserved to know the wedding wasn't just canceled, it was never going to happen. I sent it from a new email, one he couldn't trace, and then I logged out and shut the laptop. I stood on the back porch of the beach house that evening, barefoot on the worn wood, watching the sun slide down into the ocean with the same quiet finality as a door closing. The waves moved steadily, not concerned with who was watching, and I let myself breathe deeply, for once without the dull throb of second-guessing, humming in the background. I had done what I needed to do. I had not yelled. I had not begged. I had not fought for space in a relationship that had never been built to hold me fully. I made a list of all the times I should have walked away. And this time, finally, I did. They said I was cold. They said I was calculated. They said I should have had a conversation or given him closure or handled things more gracefully, as though grace is only ever measured by how softly you let someone hurt you. In the weeks after I left, that was the word that came up most often, grace. It showed up in voicemails from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, in half-hearted text messages from friends who were more worried about losing a +1 than they were about my emotional well-being, and even in one final, infuriating email from Ethan himself, who, in a last-ditch effort to control the narrative, wrote that he hoped I would eventually find the grace to reflect. I never responded. I didn't need to. Some messages are better left unanswered, especially when they're not questions but accusations dressed up as concern. 2 months had passed since I'd walked out of that restaurant, since I'd thanked his mother for the meal, and since I'd watched Ethan's perfectly rehearsed world begin to quietly unravel around him. I didn't celebrate the aftermath. I didn't pour champagne or dance around with smug satisfaction, not because I wasn't tempted to, but because none of it was ever about revenge. That's the part people struggle to understand. What I did, what I chose, wasn't out of spite. It was survival. It was an exhale after holding my breath for 2 years, after trying to mold myself into a shape that made someone else comfortable while my own edges slowly vanished. It was a correction, not an attack. A return to equilibrium. The beach house where I had landed, part sanctuary, part hideout, sat quietly at the end of a narrow, cracked road that seemed forgotten by the world. The paint on the front steps was flaking. The porch creaked under my feet every time I moved from one side to the other, and the pipes moaned with age whenever I turned on the water, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that I had space. Space to think, space to feel, space to not explain myself to anyone for the first time in years. I spent long mornings sitting on the back deck with coffee that I brewed too strong, watching the sea shift from gray to blue and back again, letting my mind wander without guilt or interruption. I wasn't in a rush to start over. That phrase, too, had been offered far too many times, as though my life was a board game that needed resetting after a bad turn. The truth was, I didn't need to start over. I needed to continue, on my own terms. I wasn't looking for someone new to fill the silence. I wasn't trying to prove a point or reinvent myself into something shinier or more palatable. I was simply living, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The fallout back home had slowed, but the ripples were still being felt. Marla, according to Tina, had withdrawn from her usual social obligations and was telling people that the family had decided to keep things private, which in her world meant she was still furious but trying to control the damage. Ethan's business had taken a few hits, nothing catastrophic, but enough to rattle him. Apparently, one of his clients, a woman he had once dismissed as overly sensitive, had read between the lines of the engagement collapse and quietly taken her business elsewhere. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I simply didn't care anymore. Indifference is often mistaken for cruelty, but in truth, it is the final form of liberation. Tina visited me once, a week after I sent out the Dropbox folder. She brought wine and too many snacks, and we sat on the floor like we used to in our 20s, laughing too loudly and talking too fast. She asked me if I'd heard the rumors, that Ethan was telling people I had snapped, that I was unstable, that I had sabotaged the relationship out of insecurity. I just shook my head and smiled, not because it was funny, but because I expected it. It was always going to be easier for him to cast himself as the wounded party than to admit he had slowly eroded someone's self-worth while hiding behind compliments and social polish. We talked late into the night, the kind of conversation that reminded me of who I used to be before I started editing myself to fit inside someone else's life. I told her everything: the journal, the backup plan, the burner accounts, the strategic drops of information. She listened, wide-eyed and slightly horrified. But when I finished, she just raised her glass and said, "That was some real queen-level planning. Remind me never to piss you off." We laughed, not because it was all a joke, but because laughter is sometimes the only way to let the truth breathe. In the quiet days that followed, I did something I hadn't done in years. I let myself dream without filtering it through someone else's expectations. I thought about going back to school, not because it would make me more impressive or marketable, but because I missed learning. I considered adopting a dog, one that would shed all over the furniture and bark at the mailman, because I could finally make a mess without being judged for it. I even entertained the idea of writing a book, not about Ethan specifically, but about what it means to reclaim your own narrative after giving it away for far too long. People love a story with a clean ending. They want resolution, a clear villain, and a triumphant heroine walking off into the sunset with a better man or a new job or a sense of poetic justice. But life doesn't usually work like that. Some endings are soft, some are quiet. Some aren't really endings at all, just new chapters written with a steadier hand. I didn't need to find love again to prove I was lovable. I didn't need to make Ethan regret losing me. I just needed to be able to look at myself in the mirror without flinching. The last message I received from him came about 3 weeks ago. It was short, just a voicemail. His voice, for once, was not smooth or self-assured. He sounded tired and a little hollow. He said, "You embarrassed me. You'll regret this someday." I listened to it once, then I deleted it. Standing on the porch that evening, barefoot again, I watched the sky stretch open in front of me. The clouds painted in that brief, perfect pink that only lasts for a few minutes before the dark creeps in. I thought about everything that had been said, everything that had been left unsaid, and I let it all drift away with the tide. She's not perfect, but she walked, and she'll do just fine.